The good news for the estate is that within 9 months thereafter, all of a sudden, life had sprung back into her brand and her record sales and her movie sales and everything that she was involved in. Suddenly there was this resurgence of interest, and you go from minus 20 to plus 40 million in 9 months.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
So today we're picking up with the second episode of our show on Whitney Houston. There's a lot of great information here, a lot of opportunities to learn, a fascinating person, incredible talent. So we're giving this show a little more time than we typically do, the celebrities that we look at. And also, I'll remind you that I am coming to you from Naples, Naples, Florida, that is. And it does mean that I'll be interacting with Marlea remotely, but hopefully that's not a distraction from what we're doing. So Marlea, let's go forward and continue our discussion of Whitney Houston. The one thing we need to circle back and talk a few minutes about, talk about the one child that she had. And this will be a little confusing to audience, but we're going to call them, we'll call her Bobbi. She's known as Bobbi, Bobbi. Mm-hmm. And then there's if we're talking about her dad, the divorced husband, his name is Bobby, Bobby, Bobby Brown. But so anyway, when I use the word Bobby, if I mean the husband, I'll tell you. Otherwise, we're talking about the daughter. So tell our listeners something about Bobbi. When was she born?
Yeah, so their one daughter, Bobbi Kristina Brown, she was born in 1993. She wasn't really in the limelight with her mom a whole lot. I don't think that her mom wanted the same things for her. She never did really what Whitney's mom did for her. And like Sissy brought her around all the clubs and everything. And I don't really think Whitney necessarily wanted the same life for her daughter.
Well, I mean, in fairness, let me interrupt you though.
You're fine.
In fairness, you can't be a junkie and be a good parent.
Yes, also that. So, yeah. And if we think about it, 93 was around, when her addiction started getting worse. And I just don't think, I think that probably also played into part of her addiction because postpartum, everything like that, you have all these kinds of feelings. So that, that kind of went on. Bobbi grew up, though, and eventually we'll go on to see that she unfortunately followed in her mom's footsteps in the way of drug abuse as well. But yeah, she was kept out of the limelight. There's stuff known about her, but she never got into singing. She never got into anything like that. She was really honestly she had a normal childhood for the most part, obviously with your mom being Whitney Houston and your dad, Bobby Brown. And they're both addicts. I don't know how normal that can get, but
yeah, it may be that we just don't, we weren't hearing about problems she was having. But as we talk about how her life goes, there has to be some relationship between what she saw every day. I mean, both parents addicts, you know.
Yeah.
It'd been better if Sissy could have taken her. And surely she spent a lot of time with Sissy, do you think?
Yeah, I think she spent a lot of time with Sissy. And I know that Whitney did bring her to some of her concerts and everything. And she was on a one single song on one of her albums, but it wasn't anything grandiose like Sissy did for Whitney back then. But I know she was close to her grandmother, and I know she was close to her uncles as well, probably because they did, raise her for a good part of her life also, because her mom was out and her dad, I mean, like you said, they had a really messy divorce. She did get full custody of Bobbi, but I don't think she was around a whole lot to help raise her necessarily.
And in fairness, I mean, the uncles, the brothers of Whitney,
yeah,
they're not. I think Sissy would probably be the best hope.
Yes,
was the best hope for her. So anyway, she's alive at the time of Whitney's death.
Mm-hmm. And she does. So Whitney had signed a will in 1993. And so she does inherit what would have been Whitney Houston's estate, but the estate was actually negative $20 million because of all the debt and everything else.
Yeah. So we kind of winding through the process here. We've talked about Whitney's life and her circumstances, and she has this child. She's divorced at the time of her death. She doesn't have another man in her life at that stage that we know of, and she has this daughter who at that time was age what, 18?
Yes, age 18. Yeah.
Yeah. I think she was 18. So she had this 18-year-old daughter. So Whitney, as you said, Whitney had prepared a will, and to her credit, the will was made in 93, I think.
93 and revised in 2000.
Yeah. So, and it was a pretty simple will, but it named her husband at the time. It named him to be the guardian in the event of her death. He was also to be a trustee. And so he had certain rights and privileges that came with being a husband legally at the time. I think this will was drafted in New Jersey, but I'm not positive. So it does matter where a will is prepared.
I think you're right.
Yeah, as to what law will govern its interpretation. It's presumed to be governed by the law of the place in which it was drafted, although you can have language in there that says that you want to have a choice of laws of another state. And as long as it doesn't conflict with respect to an important value of that other state, then the other state will try to honor that laws as to distribute it according to what the state in which you chose would have distributed it.
Yeah.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
Anyway, Whitney, for reasons we don't know the details, in 2000 or so, she decides to update it. And she updated it for some good reasons. She knew that her husband was now an ex-husband, so she wanted to change some of his rights and privileges, and she wanted to be sure that all of her assets went to her child. And she also wanted to be sure that the terms of a trust that she was setting up, called a testamentary trust, were going to be valid with different trustees. So it's interesting, the provision that she had in her trust. She said of her assets that she wanted them to be distributed by the trustees of this trust that would be created when she died. She didn't create it when she was alive. That's a inter vivos trust. She wanted these trustees to give her daughter 10% of the balance at the time that she turns 21. So when she's 18, in another 3 years, she would have gotten 10%, and she did. So then at age 25, she would have gotten 25%. And then at age 30, she'd have gotten the balance. So 10%, 25%, the balance.
And we always talk about don't do that.
We talk about that a lot.
Please don't do
anyway,
that.
So these were the terms, and I'll comment on that in a minute. So it's a very simple will, quite frankly, too simple for somebody in Whitney's position. You just wonder, even when it was first prepared originally, 93 even, you had somebody who was incredibly world famous and successful. You wonder, why was there not better estate planning at that time? But certainly later, when she has a child, she's been divorced, you wonder, why wasn't there something more sophisticated? There could have been things so much better for Whitney, for her daughter, Bobbi, for other family members, as it turns out. So I don't understand those things, and I'm reluctant to accuse the lawyer of failing her, because it might be that the lawyer that she went to, tried to plead with her, or beseeched her to do the right thing. It may very well be that the lawyer did everything he or she could to create something that was better. We don't know that. We just know that this lawyer created this document, and this is what was signed.
Yeah.
So Whitney dies. As you point out, in 2012, the estimated value of the estate was a negative $20 million. And you may say, well, how can this be? Well, and I don't have all the figures here. I'm looking at a few of the provisions. Wait, we should point this out. When she divorced Bobbi Brown, when she divorced Bobbi Brown in 2007, at that time she had a net estate of about $6 million after debts, which really, that's low.
That's so low.
It goes to show you there's no evidence of fraud here.
Yeah.
That to where we can say, oh, $100 million, we know where that went. But no, there's no evidence of fraud. I'm afraid it's dissipation and waste.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, a lot of people blame, so she did sign a label with Sony, and it was apparently supposed to be worth $100 million, and they only gave her 40. But I was still like, that's still not, still don't know how you take 40 million and go down to 6 million at that point, in between all those years, which isn't a long time.
Well, and that lawsuit was eventually settled.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, there was a lawsuit over that dispute, and it was eventually settled. Sony is a company that has lots of assets. To the extent that there's fraud, and incidentally, I don't know the details of that contract. I don't know that you can find those details, but I would say this even. It's not fraud and manipulation when you just are so disconnected or desperate for cash because of drugs and you sign anything.
Yeah.
It's hard to blame anybody for that. It's not like a naive young 18-year-old artist being exploited by a big company. This is a 30-something-year-old or 40-something-year-old artist who has wasted much of her fortune and wants more soon and is prepared to sign a deal that just doesn't make sense. Now, in this case, I don't know the details of that deal, but I'm just pointing out that this is not the sort of exculpating condition that you could find with many artists who are broke when they die. So $6 million, and this is 2007. Well, it didn't get any better.
No.
It went downhill from there. And let's go over just a few of the assets when she died. Clive Davis had loaned her this is how broke she was. Yeah. Clive Davis lent her $1.2 million to get sober and to pay off her most urgent debts. So she was so lacking in resources that he has to essentially make, well, it wasn't a gift. As a practical matter, there were no assurances that she would ever repay him. And that money, of course, was soon gone. And maybe I suspect he was repaid later.
Yeah. And she still did have the 2 properties. And then she had, of course, her jewelry, her clothes, so on and so forth. But I mean, even the townhouse, she had a $1.2 million townhouse in Atlanta, and it still had a $1 million mortgage on it. So her assets weren't necessarily great. They still had debt to them. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just think that it's sad that all this money disappeared. So what's really interesting is that while what we found is that the net value of the estate, there was a finding, I assume, by the court of a value of negative $20 million. What's really interesting is we know now, and soon knew even then, that this was in fact worth a lot more, because after she dies, almost predictably, suddenly, her musical catalog becomes more valuable. More of her albums are selling. Her brand is now in demand, or at least it's in the public eye in a way that stimulates new interest. So this was predictable. So one thing that I don't know that I would like to know is what the IRS accepted as the value. I mean, it was very naive if the IRS accepted this negative $20 million.
That's what that's what I was wondering too. Because I was like, well, how would can they tax? Like, would they be able to even tax anything at that point?
Well, a valuation is normally determined at the time of death,
Mm-hmm.
and the taxes are due, within 9 months of death. So if they look at the date of death and do the valuation, one could have argued it was negative 40 at that point, but you couldn't argue it very persuasively, because we do know catalogs and we do know brands have value.
Yeah.
And so I would love to know what the IRS ended up saying was owed to them.
Yeah.
But they may have just taken this official court finding of minus 20 million, and in which case there was no taxes paid. That would surprise me, but it could have happened. Anyway, so the good news for the estate is that within 9 months thereafter, all of a sudden, life had sprung back into her brand and her record sales and her movie sales and everything that she was involved in. Suddenly there was this resurgence of interest, and you go from minus 20 to plus 40 million in 9 months.
That's crazy.
That's amazing.
That is absolutely crazy. Which, we've seen it before, but we haven't ever seen it that quickly. And I think a lot of it is attributed to that movie Sparkle coming out as well. It wasn't necessarily all about her, but she did have a starring role in it. And
this came out after her death, right?
It came out right after her death. I believe it was released in April, I want to say. But yeah, and that's where a majority of her album sales actually came from, was after her death, which I think is crazy.
So then moving along with her story, though, so she did have this resurgence, this movie now that's probably a bigger success than it would have been, Sparkle, although not to diminish the movie, but also record sales, other movie sales, to the extent there's merchandise out there already, that suddenly those sales go up. So she's back in the news and in the public interest. Thereafter, the family begins managing the estate. The terms we know, or at least the appointed trustees. And before I talk about that, we do know what the distribution plan is. There's one beneficiary, that's her daughter, Bobbi. And there are contingent beneficiaries, meaning if something happens to Bobbi, these other people are in line. But unless something happens to Bobbi, there's one beneficiary for everything. And remember, Bobbi is 18 at her death. She's not to get anything until she turns 21. And at that point, she's to get 10%. And then at age 25, 25%. And then the rest at age 30. So Bobbi has her own problems. And we're going to start rushing through this because I know we've kind of given this subject a little more time than I thought we'd run in this show. But Bobbi has her own problems. You can develop your own theories to what extent this is genetic or environmental. Genetics do play a role in people's vulnerability to addictions, but so does environment. And we know that Bobbi had the problems that her mother had and her dad very soon, and may have already had by the time of Whitney's death. And so Bobbi ends up dying at 2015?
Yeah, in 2015 at age 22. She went into a little bit of a coma for a couple of months, and then she ended up passing away.
Yeah. It was a drug-induced. It was a coma, actually, that was drug-induced, and there was some belief that she might recover. So they kept her on a ventilator for months. And ultimately, it was decided that they would do hospice, and they disconnected it. So she lived 7 or 8 months, I believe. But it was a significant period of time. But it's a sad story, and it was a drug overdose, and similar to her mother's.
Very, very similar. Yeah.
And to think this is 3 years after her mother's death.
Yeah. It's just so sad.
I know, but I think it says you just can't control the decisions of somebody who has reached adulthood or close to adulthood. And in this case, she did end up, and I'm sure it didn't help her any, at age 21, which would have been 2014, I guess, she ends up getting 10% of the estate. So she got several million,
yeah,
$2 to $3 million. And I'm sure that was not good for her. So it probably accelerated her decline. And she's dead a year later. So she never got the age 25 distribution or, of course, the balance at age 30. Now we know the contingent beneficiaries come in. The contingent beneficiaries are Sissy and the two brothers. I think that's it, right?
Yeah, Michael and Gary, that was it.
Yeah. So now here's what's interesting. If that had not been in a trust, then had it just been paid out, and there was some that was paid out. So whatever assets that Bobbi had could have been claimed by a husband, but she wasn't married at the time, although that was a lawsuit. A man claimed that she was married to him. And we've seen that before. Fortunately, that claim was disproven. And there were no illegitimate children with women. It's easier to document whether a child is the deceased or not. But in this case, the money continued to be in the trust. One of the good things about a trust, it can continue to be in the trust. And then whenever one beneficiary dies, then automatically the beneficiaries that are next step into the shoes of that beneficiary with similar terms, or they could even have different terms. So we don't know what the distribution will be, though, for the mother and two brothers specifically. I suspect that it may be directly distributed to them, the ownership interest. Hopefully not. Hopefully it continues to be held in the trust. But it is a private trust, so we don't know all those details. I will tell you that testamentary trusts, you can access information much easier because wills are filed publicly versus a trust that you create in the person's lifetime that is never probated. So it's never filed with public records. And as a result, often you can keep things confidential. So moving along here a little quickly, I want to talk about what I think are kind of the lessons here. First, I would say, and most obviously, is there should be a living trust and not simply a will. A living trust is a trust that's created in the lifetime. It means that you avoid all the probate, you avoid the public aspect, and you can start implementing control over the assets during the person's lifetime. It can be made a revocable trust, or it can be made an irrevocable trust. For Whitney, that would have been a much better idea. So I don't know why, in this case, somebody with her fame and fortune, there was not a living trust. It was just a huge mistake. And fortunately, in this case, because of a disastrous life, or a disastrous end, I should say, there weren't significant estate or gift taxes, we don't think, subject to what I said a while ago. But the whole point is, there normally would have been. I mean, except for this disaster, yes, there would have been a lot of gift and estate taxes due. And the good news is that if you want to avoid a good portion of those, you can. All you have to do is plan, and you can dodge not all of your estate and gift taxes. Sometimes you can, all of them. But I'm being cautious here in saying that at a minimum, you can save a ton of money, a lot of money. Millions in a state such as this by simply going to the trouble and creating the proper estate planning. I mean, it's that simple. So you pay a lawyer, in her case, in today's dollars, maybe you pay a lawyer, with that wealthy, complications and good planning and all, maybe $15,000 to $20,000, we'll say. I mean, some of you are saying, wow, it's a lot of money.
That's not even that bad. Yeah.
We're talking about saving millions of money that would be gone if you didn't pay. So it's one of the best bargains that you're going to find in terms of spending $15,000 and getting a return of tens of thousands of percent rate of return.
Yeah.
So, but for most of you, to do good estate planning is going to be $3,000, something like that. Even if you have some assets, maybe $4,000. I'm just telling you, you can't be penny wise and nickel foolish. I mean, you've got to recognize that estate planning is a marvelous, marvelous deal, worth far more than it costs. And in this case, you don't want to say that it ended up not being as painful as it should have been, because it's painful in other ways. Had her life gone the way she hoped, and we would have hoped, then unfortunately she'd have lost a good part of it in taxes when she died. So that was just a huge error. And also, I would, apart from just the issue of avoiding tax liability, is liquidity. And another problem would have been if she had died and again, without tax planning, so there have been taxes due, and she has to pay for that. Well, what assets does she sell? The money has to be paid in 9 months. So that means, for example, in this hypothetical, this very probable hypothetical that I'm talking about now, she'd have owed $10 million, $20 million, $30 million in taxes. So she has to pay that. How do you get that much cash out of your estate? Typically, you own real estate. You own, in her case, a catalog. She has intellectual property in terms of recordings. But how do you turn that into 30? Well, you can sell it. You can sell it. And often that's a tragic thing to have to go to a Sony or some large company and sell your catalog. But believe me, it happens, because when people don't plan, then they have to take the assets that it's not smart to sell and sell them in order to pay the taxes. And we've seen this before in other cases we talked about. So the trust distribution plan, this is a pet peeve of ours on this show. Why give the 10% at age 21? Why give 25% at age 25? And why give the rest of it at age 30? Do we think that somebody at age 30 is going to suddenly be responsible? And even if they were, why would we not allow them to have the best of all worlds and give them a trust in which the trustee has authority to give them money that they want liberally, meaning you just make it clear in the instructions that, within reason, I want them to have what they want. Again, you pick your trustee carefully. And that way they have the best of all worlds. When they marry, that assets will never be vulnerable. When they get sued, if they get sued for something, if there's a bankruptcy for reasons perhaps having nothing to do with their good judgment, all these assets are protected. Mm-hmm. So it's a marvelous, marvelous thing to be able to live your life with your net worth inside a trust. And when you want something within reason, you get it. That you have to have the trustee to have some authority. Otherwise, you don't have the protection of a trust. The reason you do is because the law says you don't have control. Mm-hmm. So there has to be some sense in which you don't have control. Otherwise, it's a mirage and it won't hold up. But anyway, in this case, the distribution plan was just bad. It was bad. And it had there been, $100 million in there, which had things not gone sideways for Whitney, there would have been at least. Then what a marvelous plan. It's paid out, but it not only goes through Bobbi's life, and Bobbi lives a good life and has the money she wants, but it goes on to the next generation. Yep. And then if it makes it there, it goes on to the next generation. So it's just huge, huge benefit. Okay, and I guess I would also mention that there's a failure to update the estate plan. In this case, there was the fact that you had a husband who could have chosen, had they been married at the time, he could have chosen to take an elective share. An elective share means that whatever provisions you've made for others, the husband can reach in, or the wife can reach in and demand, depending on the state, 1/3 or even 1/2. Yeah. But they can just reach in and say, whatever the will of my deceased wife says, I want to take 1/3. And the law will permit that in many states. It's called an elective share. It's the right of a spouse. You shouldn't be able to, the idea is you shouldn't be able to disinherit your spouse entirely. So in this case, often for a long time before they were divorced, they were estranged and each kind of living their own lives to some extent. That was this huge period of vulnerability. where there could have been a loss of control. And even if you do update it during this period of time, you have to also think about other things. You have to think about if you name this person as an administrator or a trustee in your will. And even if you're divorced, depending on the state, if you name them as a trustee or as an administrator, they may not be disinherited from that or disqualified from that. Some states will kind of protect you from, your own oversight, but not all states do that, particularly as to roles like a trustee or administrator versus that of a beneficiary. So it's critical that if you're estranged from your spouse, you take protective action then. If you are divorced, you still take protective action. In this case, thankfully, she was divorced at the time she updated this, but she did fail to change some of the provisions. And one regarded being control over the conservatorship, which means the assets of Bobbi. Now, by the time that she dies, Bobbi is 18 years old, so that was kind of moot. But had it not been, there would have been a dispute. In fact, there was a dispute over the conservatorship whenever she was in this medically induced coma, where her father came in and wanted to have control, the conservatorship of her estate. That ended up being moot. So in this case, when we look at what should have happened with her estate, as well as what did happen, but I want us to think about what should have happened had things gone the way everyone planned. This would have been a very bad estate plan for her. And it turned out to be a bad estate plan anyway, but it would have been worse, oddly enough. You hate to say that, given that what could be worse than what happened. But in a monetary terms, it could have been worse. So I would also make another comment that is a little more vague, but nonetheless critically important. And that's that when you have somebody who's in a condition such as Whitney was in for the last 10 years of her life, I realize that you cannot reach in and forcefully have someone quit taking drugs, make good decisions about their lives, be a better parent. You can't do that with adults. Mm-hmm. You can, if somebody deteriorates far enough, you can have them declared incompetent, but that's when they've gone way down the road. And then, yes, you can have somebody manage their financial affairs. Ultimately, you can't really change the judgment of somebody who is an adult. That's the bottom line. So what would have been realistic? I think that the starting point was to create a trust during her lifetime. I think those around her who should have urged her, importuned her to say, look, you have the ability when you get a check for it to go directly into this trust, and it'll be locked up and it'll be safe for your daughter, maybe even by the terms of the trust, safe for you someday down the road. I think that even somebody who's in the throes of an addiction, I think that there are moments of clarity where you can intervene properly timed and have them make a decision. The starting point is to set up a vehicle for money to be placed there. And once it's placed there, it's locked up and can't be accessed until certain conditions are met. So that's less difficult, getting someone to see the reason of that at moments of clarity. And there are always moments of clarity in any addict's life. And at that time, get the vehicle set up. And then when the vehicle's set up, having, just arranging on those particular occasions when payments are due for them to go into this trust and get their cooperation just for that moment in time. And some would be cynical and say, no, you can't do anything with addicts. And I know that there's some truth to that argument. Ultimately, addicts have to come to a conclusion that they're on the wrong path and sort of an epiphany. But I still argue that it's not a fool's errand to try to set up machinery for somebody such as Whitney Houston and others who have responsibility and have assets and who are making bad decisions, to try to create a protective shell, and that shell would be in the form of an irrevocable trust. And you only have to have their cooperation at a point in time where they say, yeah, I'll agree to have this money from this sale. 50% of it I'll agree to put into this trust. I think that there probably were points like that along the road for Whitney where money could have been safely preserved. But again, it does take a lot of effort to set something like that up and to get the cooperation of the person to do it. But I'm mentioning that as perhaps the only avenue where you can preserve something for loved ones as well as for this person later in life when they're still in the throes of addiction. We're running over today, but one thing we've got to talk about kind of if we want to find a happy ending here, I think the happy ending is to be found in what's happened with Whitney's estate.
Yeah.
It's what's happened with her legacy, with her contribution to music and the arts generally. So originally when she died, the family tried to manage her sister-in-laws, interestingly enough, were kind of acting as trustees to help manage the estate. And managing the estate is a much bigger job than any of us realize. So before we close here, I'm going to read some excerpts from an article that appeared in Variety magazine, February of 22. It's an article by Jeff Mayfield, and it's a very good article. And the article is just about the business of preserving an artist's legacy and their assets, and what a challenging and multifaceted sort of endeavor it is. And some of us think, and we've talked on this show about so often when artists die, that the intellectual property is the most valuable thing. And we talked about, why can't people manage that better? And we've seen where it was mismanaged. And I think what this discussion makes clear is that this is the operation of a very complicated business. And it's not something that a family can do well on their own, despite their best intentions. Now, at the time when Priscilla Presley, she didn't do it all herself by any means, but she was reasonably directly involved in Elvis's estate. But this was at a time when there was less complexity than there is today. Now, media and technology has become so complicated and the rules so arcane that I think it's not practical for a person, no matter how talented they are, if they're not in the industry, to be able to manage that estate effectively. So here in the estate, it did gain value, as we talked about when Whitney died, but it didn't gain the sort of value it should have. The family tried their best. These two sister-in-laws, to their credit, not her brothers, her two sister-in-laws, were involved in trying to assure that there were contracts by which people could obtain the right to market things, or that they wanted to be sure in police that checks were paid for the payments on royalties. Anytime her image was used, to try to police that and sue where you need to. But it was a lackluster job, to be honest with you. And so here's the difference that a pro can make. There's a company called Primary Wave. And this company, while it's known as in the industry originally as publishers, music publishers, they've since broadened to where they provide all the services. They provide marketing management. They provide collections for all fees related to royalties. They keep the accounting. They go out and look for opportunities in movies, whether it's film or stage or on Broadway, whatever it is. They are actively engaged in enhancing the value of the estate and the revenues and profitability, growing the estate in terms of its value and the legacy. So I'll go through this article real quickly here. This is Variety again, February 22, article by Jeff Mayfield. A renewed focus on Houston's music began as soon as Primary Wave partnered with the estate in 2019. So this is 7 years later. And they started out by taking a 50% stake in her music assets. And then they're paid otherwise, perhaps participate for other assets. It was time to rebuild Whitney's business and Primary Wave with its arsenal of industry professionals were the right fit, a team package to elevate Whitney's legacy to the next level. This is what Pat Houston, her sister-in-law and former manager, said. And she serves as executor, I should add. We have massively, over the course of our 3-year partnership, this is the CEO of Primary Wave, we have massively, over the course of a 3-year partnership, improved the earnings of the estate. We've basically quadrupled the earnings stream and of the estate through a lot of low-hanging fruit. We renegotiated the partnerships they have with various vendors, focusing on merchandise, digital strategy, social media enhancement, upping the game in general. The first salvo in the company's stewardship was this producer, KYGO, Kigo. It was a remix of Houston, which she covered. Remember Higher Love? I bet many people don't know this. When that was originally recorded, that was recorded years ago. It's a Steve Winwood hit in the early 90s, but it was only released in Japan. So it was very popular in Japan, but it didn't achieve the success that later did. So they had that remixed, reissued in 2019. It reached number 1 on Billboard's Dance Club Play chart and number 7 on adult contemporary radio. Not only sparking streams for the body of work, but spurring a series of branding and merchandise opportunities. So it triggered, people reawoke again to her many good songs. And so all of her songs started selling better. All of her albums started selling better, as well as the branded merchandise. Then the biopic that came out, I guess, that year, I Want to Dance with Somebody. Many of you have seen that. It's really great. But it was Sony Pictures was involved with it. It was co-produced with Primary Wave. And incidentally, the mentor, Houston, her mentor, Clive Davis, was involved in that as well. So that was a huge success. And again, it called attention to Whitney. All of a sudden, the value, just like the stock market, the value of the estate went up like 30% the year following the issue of that, after quadrupling in value the year before, just over the course of the new management. Talking about the remix of this recording, Higher Love, which again was huge. They happened to come across it in the vault, and this is how huge a professional management company can be for the estate of an artist. So they're the ones who dug this out of the vault, and they came across this Higher Love recording, again recorded in '91, and it was different. So Primary Wave and our team got KYGO to remix the record. RCA loved it and went on the radio. It became a hit record for almost a year. Many of you know this. It's recent. So this was a hit record for almost a year, both internationally and domestic. Now, this would never have happened if somebody hadn't dug this, found this in a vault, this neglected jewel. So that kind of, it relaunched everything for Whitney, according to the people at Primary Wave. So Higher Love elevated plays for songs across her catalog. In the first 6 months after its release, her catalog tunes garnered 1.4 billion streams on major service providers. That's 47% above what it had done in the half year before. So it was just a phenomenal sort of find that was able to fast forward the growth in the value of this estate. So just another couple things. They're now coming up with the revenue gains that's cited don't include, for example, this is just an example of ways in which they can be overlooked. There was a launch of a Houston NFT. This was of an early unreleased demo. I don't know how many of you all follow non-fungible tokens, but anyway, NFTs. And their timing was exquisite. May not have worked today, but the timing was exquisite. And they got $1.1 million for the release of that demo through NFT. It's sold through auction. So, I mean, it's just an example, $1.1 million, just like that. And it's because of an idea that they had in marketing. It also enabled the Houston hologram shows that they had in Vegas and on tour, which began in 2020, another source of revenues. We've created a lot of brand opportunities that haven't been announced yet. We're organizing the estate, creating these opportunities that are music-related, merchandise-related, marketing-related. Broadway and Vegas mark bigger destinations. And this is Mestel, who's the CEO of Primary Wave. They started developing a Broadway adaptation of the Houston film, of the Houston biopic. We're in talks right now in Las Vegas to create a Whitney Houston Cirque-like destination show. They've launched branded products for a while. I think at the time of this article, their products were in Target. This was new. This wasn't done before. And they're still trying to protect her reputation. And that's an important component of this whole discussion, is to be able to capitalize on her reputation or brand without harming it. And it says our closing statement here. Our team has a lot of brand deals that we'll be announcing soon. Adds Mestel in Primary Waves thinking the various music, merchandise, branding opportunities, along with the film, Broadway production, Vegas shows, aren't separate events, but they're related platforms that set the stage for each subsequent initiative. So you can see how running an estate such as this is very much a complicated business, and it requires expertise in a lot of different areas, and it requires a number of employees who are pursuing a coordinated strategy. This is what can happen with an estate properly managed. Now, we don't know the value of that estate today, but I guarantee you it's a whole lot more than the $30 million that experts had around 2015 when Bobbi died. So this is the, I guess, as happy as it gets in terms of this story. So it is something positive for the family and positive for her memory. So this has been, I know we've gone over. How much did we spill over, Justin?
By a lot. So this.
Okay, we can think about whether we want to break this into pieces.
We'll have to.
Yeah, we'll probably have to for our audience. But I want you, our audience, to know that when we have good material like this, we do end up with longer shows, and I try not to end up. I'm very thoughtful about not spilling over in length unless I think there's something really meaty here and helpful. I hope my judgment is consistent with your judgment. If not, let us know if you think that when these go longer like this, that it's not as efficient use of your time. Let us know. Tell us that. But I really felt there was a lot to learn here and a lot of interest here. So we did make this an especially long show. But one thing also I'll add, our subject matter, Whitney Houston, was just an incredibly rare, talented person. And her end was sad, but thankfully her memory is going to be much better and much longer.
Yep.
All right. With that, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. I've been speaking to you from Florida today. I'm actually in Naples. So we've been by video. I don't prefer to do it this way, but I'd rather do it this way than to have us postpone shows. I hope that this format didn't detract at all from the content of the show. So this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.